Okay, so thanks to all of you who are here again. Thanks to everybody who submitted your listening journal. As I mentioned to some of you already, I'm hoping to dig into those really over the weekend, and I'll try to actually incorporate some of the music that you mentioned into class materials as I can, but also for your final projects, especially if you have a particular piece you want to focus on, there may be some opportunity for you to dig in there as well. So thanks for filling those out. Those are always a blast to read. And we've got a whole bunch of different perspectives all around, so it'll be really cool to work through. Just a reminder, so today is currently Tuesday. We'll have another lecture tomorrow. After we're done today with today's PowerPoint, you should be fully equipped to be able to complete your homework that's due tomorrow. So if you wanted to start on that tonight, you'll be able to, just as a heads up. Okay, so we are continuing our concepts of rhythm and meter. Yesterday, we talked a lot about the basic building blocks of rhythm, but today we're going to talk about how those building blocks are organized in a more systematic way, specifically through meter and those time signature symbols that we saw. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is what we call simple time. Now, in this class, we'll talk about two different kinds of time, simple and compound, and we'll talk about compound time tomorrow. This isn't necessarily a value judgment. Simple time isn't easier and compound isn't harder. They're just ways to describe different aspects of the beat and its division. But before we get into that, let's do some warm up. I'm calling this rhythmic math because I don't know what else to call it besides this, but it's not really math as much as it is proportions. So I have 8 of these. We'll do them in chunks of 4. Let's start off a bit easy. Basically, how many half notes equals 1 whole note, for instance? So here's the symbols we saw yesterday. To refresh your memory, whole note, it's an empty oval, an empty note head as we call it, with no stem. Add a stem makes it a half note, fill that in makes it a quarter note, and then add a flag makes it an 8th note, 2 flags a 16th note. So we got the whole spectrum here. Go ahead and take, I don't know, 30 seconds or so, and just to yourselves, try to see if you can do these relatively quickly, some rhythmic math. And I'll just hum the Jeopardy theme to myself, I suppose. Okay, so that's about 30 seconds or so. If you're not totally done, that's totally fine. So I'm going to reveal these first 4 answers. Here we go. So one whole note is equal to 2 half notes. 2 halves make a whole, so to speak. If we're adding up 2 eighth notes, 2 eighth notes equal 1 quarter note. If you remember our tree on the hierarchy, quarter notes are here, and then they split up into 2 eighth notes, so 2 go back into 1. 2 16th notes equal 1 eighth note, the same type of deal. And now here's something a little bit tricky. 1 quarter note is equal to half the value of a half note. It takes 2 quarter notes to equal 1 half note. So therefore, if we only have 1, that only equals half. And then do I hear a question? No. Okay. So those are kind of the straightforward ones. Let's go ahead and do some harder ones now that involve dots. So just to refresh your memory, dots are little symbols that look like periods that we add to a note. It adds half the value of the note to itself. So a whole note, if you dotted it, would be the value of a whole note plus the value of a half note. Okay, so here we are. Here's 4 more. These are going to be a little bit harder, just so you all know. They're a little bit more tricky because of the complications that a dot brings. So I'll give you 30 more seconds, and then we'll talk through these answers as well. Okay, so these are a little bit trickier because we're dealing with more complicated proportions here. So I'm going to go ahead and reveal the next four, and then I'll talk through them. So here we are. So if you dot a quarter note, well, essentially a quarter note plus half of itself is equal to 1.5 of itself, so to speak. So that's pretty straightforward. This first one here illustrates what dots do. Now, this is tricky and will become particularly useful later in the week. If we dot a half note, but then think of going a level below, it's not 1.5, it becomes 3, because a half note is equal to 2 quarter notes, and half of a half note is 1 quarter note. 2 plus 1 gives you 3. Okay. This is a tricky one, a dotted eighth note. So now we're going up in our levels. So an eighth note is half of a quarter note. If you add half of an eighth note to an eighth note, that gives you 3/4, 75% of a quarter note. Okay, this is probably the most tricky one that we have here. But I will say that this class is not as math heavy after this first week, I promise. Okay, and then finally at the bottom here, 2 dotted eighth notes gives you 3 quarter notes. Now you may go, well, how does that work? Well, a dotted eighth note is worth, am I spacing here? Sorry, I am absolutely spacing. That actually isn't right. Well, that's why I'm spacing, because it's not right. Ignore the 3. I will fix that when I upload the slides. Sorry about that. I went back and changed something and didn't update the math. In any case, so these first 3 here are an illustration of your dotted values. Should be 1.5. Yes, exactly. Yes, that should be 1.5. Yeah, that's my mistake, everybody. I forgot to update it. When I upload the slides to GoucherSpace, I will fix that. So that is my mistake. Okay, here we go. So let's now talk about some review of what we talked about yesterday. So music can be thought of as breaking down into beats and rhythm. And these are different concepts. They're often used interchangeably in day-to-day life, but they're actually different. Beats are regular and can be divided into smaller parts. The beats exist in the background, whether anything's playing or not. For instance, if the beat is this pulse, and somebody isn't playing, the beat is still happening. The beat is always there. What people play is rhythm. Rhythm is variable and changes frequently. That's what makes music interesting. So rhythm happens in relationship to the beat. We can use a variety of symbols to notate rhythm, and we already saw some of these. So beyond just looking at notes on their own, we talked about flags, beams, the note heads are of course the dots, ties versus slurs, bar lines, and dots. And these are all different terms to describe rhythm. It's just a way to give us a toolbox to write down what we would be hearing in a piece of music. So this on the left here, these numbers, is called a time signature. We talked about this briefly yesterday, and I told you we'd hold off on that because today we're going to be focusing primarily on what these numbers mean and why that affects everything that we talked about yesterday. The time signature, this pertains to meter, the organization of music. So simple time. Simple time refers to when the beats of a piece are divided into twos. That's all it means. If this is your beat, imagine just dividing those into half. So if we go from this to this, dividing that into twos. That's it. As we'll see, most music in the Western tradition, whether it's pop or classical or whatever, simple time is extremely, extremely, extremely common. So this will be a familiar sound to a lot of us. In essence, every beat can be thought of as dividing into twos or further down into fours and eights. We've already seen this in thinking about how a quarter note goes into 4/16 notes. That's just dividing one beat into 4, so to speak, or into 4 divisions. Simple time is the most common way to think about beats and divisions, and especially pop music is primarily in simple time. You find other varieties in classical music and some other types of musics, but especially in pop music and rock music, simple time predominates. So we can think of that like this. If this is our beat that's kind of existing in the air, in the background, we can think of dividing that beat into 1 to 1, 1 to 2 in half, 1 to 4, or dividing that even into eighths. Now we will not see much of eighths in this class. These of course are 30-second notes, which we didn't even talk about because they're so deep on our rhythm tree. We don't see them very often. We'll primarily be focusing on dividing the beat into 2s and into 4s. And that's what this would look like. So if you recall, our beams organize notes that are smaller than a beat into beats. Well, that's exactly why. And this is what determines that. So we'll be talking for the rest of today about how to write this, how to understand this entire process. So what is a time signature? Let's come back to those two numbers that we talked about before. Time signatures tell us how long each measure is. So if you remember, a measure is just, when we're looking at that horizontal staff, a measure is just whatever's between two vertical lines, those little bar lines. A measure is just a unit that performers and composers use to be able to understand music in chunks. The bottom number tells us a note value. So the bottom number gives us a number that represents one of our notes. For instance, 4 is the number we use for quarter notes, 4 quarter. 2 is the number we use for half notes, and so on, because 1, of course, is whole note. So we can actually think of applying the names of our notes to this bottom number. Quarter note equals 4 on the bottom. So the bottom will always be one of the following: a whole note, a half note, a quarter note, an eighth note, or a 16th note. Most everything we'll be looking at exists in the quarter note, half note realm, but the bottom number will be one of these 5 options, without question, full stop. If you see a 3 on the bottom, that is incorrect, for instance, for reasons that we'll talk about later. So the bottom number represents a note value. The top number simply tells us how many of the bottom number are in each measure. If the bottom number is a quarter note, there are 4 quarter notes in each measure. This is true for when we get into compound time tomorrow too, even though compound time is different for reasons we'll talk about. This is true of all time signatures. The bottom number tells us a note value, and the top number tells us how many of those are between bar lines. So depending on the type of meter, the numbers mean different things. Now, meter is basically the same as time signature. Just so you know, I'll use these terms interchangeably. Meter is just a way to describe how our beats are configured into measures. Okay, so that's why we talk about meter and rhythm. Meter is kind of building a foundation, and rhythm is building a house on top of it. So the numbers for simple time signatures mean something different than for compound time signatures in terms of how we count this. In simple time, the bottom number is what gets the beat, and the top number is how many beats are in the measure. So in this case, there are 4 quarter notes in every measure, and the quarter note is what we would count as our beats. If we see 4 quarter notes, that means that in our measure, we just have 4 beats with nothing else on top of it. Okay, this is slightly different in compound time, so we'll refer back to this slide tomorrow especially. But for simple time, what gets the beat on the bottom and how many beats in the measure on the top. So let's talk about 4/4 time a little bit more as kind of like a case study, since it is extremely common. Most every music, as I said, will be in 4/4. So it's arguably the most common time signature in all Western music: classical music, pop music, rock music, jazz music, whatever, rap music. Most everything is 4/4. Each measure is 4 beats, and the quarter note gets the beat, hence 4/4. So each measure's rests and rhythms will add up to the value of 4 quarter notes. So here is a complete measure of 4/4. Now, let's go left to right, beat by beat, and look for where each of these 4 quarter notes are. So on the left, we start right off with the quarter note. Well, that's easy. 1 quarter note, 1 beat. This space here is 1 beat. Here, we have an 8th rest and then an 8th note. As we know from yesterday, 2 8th notes, or 2 8th rests, or a combination of the 2, when added together, form 1 quarter note. So this here is the space of our 2nd beat. 1 quarter note, 2 quarter notes. Here we have 4 16th notes. 4 16th notes add up to 1 quarter note. Therefore, this is 1 beat. And notice that these are beamed together to show that. They show you where the beats are. And then finally, this little squiggly line, if you recall from yesterday, is a quarter rest. It shows that a quarter note is not being played. This is the length of 1 beat as well. So there's our 4 beats: 1, 2, 3, 4. Each of our 4 beats add up to 4 quarter notes. Okay. Before I continue, any questions with this? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about counting in a bit. What this would sound like, for instance, if this is our beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on as it repeats. What this rhythm would be this. If it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a rest on the 4th beat. Okay, is simple time the same thing as common time? That's a great question, Larson. We'll get to that in just a second, actually. In fact, I believe right now. So while there are numerous possibilities, there are a few simple time signatures that are used more than most. So there's lots and lots of possible options, but here's a list. This is essentially comprehensive of all of the possibilities that you will see for simple time. Examples include, from left to right, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, whatever this is, come to that in a second, 2/2, whatever this is, come to that in a second, 3/2, 3/8, and 4/8. So in this case, these 3 time signatures, the quarter note gets the beat. This time signature and this time signature, the half note gets the beat. And in these 2 time signatures, the 8th note gets the beat. Seeing the whole note get the beat is kind of rare. It happens in very, very old music, and I'm talking like 16th and 17th century old music. You don't see that very often these days. Most everything's going to be quarter notes, half notes, or 8th notes. In particular, this group here is very, very common. And this group over here is less common. We'll see them, and we'll talk about 4/8 a little bit later. But this group here, if you committed 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, and 2/2 to memory, that would basically cover all of your simple time bases for most music. Now, what is this C? 4/4 is often called common time, to answer Larson's question from a second ago, because it is so frequent. So sometimes you will see just a floating C instead of 4/4. It means the same as 4/4. The historical reasons for that, I don't exactly know, because if you think about most everything that we have that's a shortcut for music notation, is to save on the cost of printing and ink. But 4/4 and C are pretty comparable in my opinion, so I don't exactly know. But in any case, if you ever see a C, it means that it's 4/4. Now, what is this over here? Well, 2/2, 2 half notes in every measure. You may go, well, hold on, 4 quarter notes in every measure and 2 half notes in every measure. Those are pretty similar. Well, it's because of how the beats are arranged. This is 4 beats and this is 2 beats. So because we go from the same note values, but change what gets the beat, the C with the slash through it represents what's called cut time. So 2/2 is often called cut time, and that's why there's a C with a slash through it. Yeah, handwriting. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's fair point. It does make handwriting easier. Yeah, so if you ever see C's or C's with a slash through it, they just represent 4/4 or 2/2. But like I said, most everything's going to be in these basically 4 options: 1, 2, 3, 4 for 2/2. We will look at 3/2, 3/8, and 4/8 in our class. They're not impossible, but they are definitely rarer. Okay. Describing time signatures. Okay, so we know what the numbers mean, but let's talk about how we can talk about meter as like a listener and just in broad strokes. So we can describe meter in a way that makes similarities between time signatures apparent. So despite the way that that list looks, while there are distinct time signatures, sometimes they sound very similar because of the ways that their beats and the number of beats in the measure are configured. For example, all meters that divide their beats into 2s are called simple times, the point of today's lecture. So if it divides into 2s, regardless of what gets the beat or how many beats in a measure, we call those simple times. The word simple describes the division, but we can use the different words to describe the number of beats. For instance, if a time signature has 2 beats in a measure, whether it's 2/4, 2/2, or 2/8, we call it duple time. If a time signature has 3 beats in a measure, we call it triple time: 3/4, 3/2, 3/8. And if a time signature has 4 beats in a measure, we call it quadruple time. Of course, 4/4 and 4/8. We don't really see 4/2 that often. So we can basically describe different times with their time signatures in these broader terms. So 2/4 is a time signature with 2 quarter notes in every measure, as we've just learned. We can thus describe this meter as simple duple time. It divides its beats into twos, and there are 2 beats in every measure, simple duple. 4/8 is a time signature where 4/8 notes are in every measure, 4/8 notes. We can thus describe this as simple quadruple time. 4 beats in every measure, divides the beat into twos. In this way, we can describe 4/4 and 4/8, that should be and, as being similar, since they're both simple quadruple time signatures. Sometimes this will sound that way. You may be listening to a piece of music and go, this is probably in 4/4, and then you may look at, find a score or find what they were looking off of, and you might see that it is in 4/8 or something weird instead. Sometimes you can't tell the difference. So this is a way to kind of relate the time signatures we see on the page to what we hear when we're listening to music. In this case, between 4/4 and 4/8, all that's different is what gets the beat. In 4/4, quarter notes get the beat, in 4/8, eighth notes get the beat. It's the same, it sounds the same potentially. Let's talk about counting now. So counting is kind of a way to get us into performance and getting us into embodying certain parts of the music, but also a way that we can kind of write down what these rhythms are to make sense of these beats. So now that we've spent time on time signatures, meter specifically, boy, oh boy, you always notice the typos, what you've gotten into it, huh? Let's turn now towards how rhythm fits in to the beat. So we started with rhythm and rhythmic values. We turned to time signatures and meter, and now we're bringing them both back together again. So as we talked about last time, rhythm isn't the same as the beat. We can use where the beats are to count what the rhythms are and where they fall. So finding the beat allows us to then count out the rhythm for each beat. This involves specific syllables for counting. Now this is going to get a little jargony for a second, but then we'll explain some more in the next slide. For instance, each beat gets a number. So if it's a time that has 2 beats in a measure, your beats can be described as 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. The division, whatever note value is below it, say it's an eighth note, if your quarter note gets the beat, gets the word and. 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and so on. And we use a little plus sign to show and because it's easy to write and over and over again. And this is where it gets tricky. The subdivision, 2 levels down, say a 16th note, if you're working with quarter note beats, gets E or depending on where it is. 1 E and a 2 E and a, 1 E and a 2 E and a, 1 E and a 2 E and a, 1 E and a 2 E and a. It sounds a little bit dorky, but that's because it allows us to say them quickly, like I just did. Now you may be going, what does this all mean? How does this allow us to count rhythm? I don't understand. Why are we learning this? Well, rhythm syllables allow us to attach a way to make sense of how our rhythms interact on the beat with a shared understanding of how to notate them. So how do you determine what gets the syllable? How do you know? Well, if we're in 4/4, whatever gets the beat gets numbers. So if we're looking at a rhythm tree here, this rhythm tree happens to coincide to a measure of 4/4. So for instance, the bottom number determines the beat. So you think about your rhythm tree. If the quarter note gets the beat, every time you see a quarter note, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if whatever you have is less than a quarter note, you need to figure out how much. The level below gets and. So if your quarter notes get beats, if you see eighth notes, the eighth note that falls in between other eighth notes, for instance, gets and. Now you may be going, what do you mean by that? For instance, if the eighth note starts on the beat, it still gets 1. But then since we have a second eighth note, we have to fill that out. So we go and. So see how we go from 1, 2, 3, 4 to 1 and 2 and, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. The level below that gets the syllables E and yeah, it's a long E and it's just short It's not A, it's E and that looks like this. 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and Now this looks really messy, but most music doesn't just have 16th notes in a measure. You see any combination of all of this. So when we talk about counting rhythm, what we're going to do is take this basic framework, look at a rhythm in context, and figure out what its counting is. So before I move on, do we have any questions? Because we've got a little bit more complicated here pretty quickly. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. So here's an example of a rhythm we can count. It's a pretty basic one, pretty straightforward. But here's the process for any rhythm. This is for any rhythm, not just this one. First, you need to figure out what your meter is, how many beats are in the measure, what gets the beat. We've looked at 4/4 a lot. We know that there are 4 beats in a measure and that the quarter note gets the beat. So in that case, there will be 4 quarter notes and 4 beats. 4 beats per measure, quarter gets the beat, boom. Now, find out where each beat starts and label it 1 to 4 as needed. Sometimes this is harder than others. Some rhythms are more complicated than others. And as we learned yesterday, ties can complicate things because ties can connect over beats or over measures. But in this case, we can see because of our beams and because of our rests, it's pretty easy to find 1, 2, 3, 4 groups. So we can label them 1 through 4 like that. Next, look at how each beat is divided. So the second beat divides into 2, therefore we can go 2 and. Your third beat divides into 3, therefore we can, or pardon me, into 4, therefore we can go 3E and A. So this rhythm, if this is our beat, would be this: 1, 2, and 3E and A. And then we rest on 4. Look for beats that are silent. In this case, 4 is silent. And sometimes the beat is part of a rest. Sometimes it's included in a tie. There's many reasons why a beat may be silent, why we might not hear a note that strikes on the beat. So in those situations, we can put the note in parentheses to show that it is there, but we just don't hear it. So that can kind of help you keep track of where your beats are, especially say you have a rest on beat 2. You don't want to go 1, leave a blank, and then start at 2 again, because that's not 2, that's beat 3. Beat 2 still exists. Beat 4, in this case, still exists. We're just not hearing anything there, if that makes sense. So we can show that with the parentheses. So this is the basic nuts and bolts of counting using what we just learned. Any questions before I move on? I'll keep asking for questions just because we're getting through a lot of material. Okay. So let's count this. This is a piece of music. This is the beginning of a piece by the French composer Camille Saint-Saëns. It's called the Swan. It's from a very famous piece called The Carnival of the Animals. You may have heard this even if you don't know what it's called. Now, despite how varied it can be, music thrives on repetition. So here's an example of that. This is written for cello and accompaniment. The cello is the line on the top. And again, we're not looking at pitch yet, so don't worry about pitch. And the bottom has the accompaniment. Now notice, if we think of this as, say, the hands on a piano, the left hand is the bottom and the right hand is the top. We have a pretty repetitive pattern here. Three beats of 8th notes, 3 beats of 16th notes. That's pretty repetitive. And if you look at the melody is more varied. That's a pretty common thing we see. Repetitive backgrounds, varied melody. Think of it like a rock band. The drummer may just be doing a simple 4 pattern the entire tune because what's happening above it are the vocals, the guitar, whatever you want. So, as I just said, written for cello and accompaniment, the bottom 2 staffs are consistent. So remember the counting for divisions are 1E and A. So if we have 3, 4, there's 3 quarter notes in every measure. And since there's no rest, it's just 1E and A, 2E and A, 3E and A. For instance, like this. And the bottom, since we just have 8th notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and. And notice that we reset where the bar lines are. That's the point of the bar lines. Because if you looked at this without the bar lines, you'd go 1E and A, 2E and A, 3E and A, 4E and A, 5E and A, 6E and A, 7E and A, and so on and so on and so on. It becomes unwieldy. So this is a great illustration of how measures help us kind of organize music into smaller digestible chunks. So I'm going to give you guys a minute. Try counting out the melody. Look at the part that we haven't looked at. We've seen this part, and that repeats ad nauseum. But look at the melody. So there's rests. You can ignore the first 2 measures. You can just start right here. There's rests. There's a tie here. Notice that there's a tie and a slur. We talked about this yesterday very briefly. So this note here ties all the way over to this note here, and then it changes. So we've got some more rhythmic variety here. So go ahead, take a minute or two. I'll go ahead and keep track on my watch here. Go ahead and take a minute or two and try to count out this melody. Okay, so whatever you got to, let's go ahead and take a look at this now. So I'll go ahead and reveal the answer, and then we'll kind of talk through it. So we start off, again, we can ignore the first two measures because there's no point really. We have 3 quarter notes in 3/4. Therefore, it's just playing on the beat. 1, 2, 3. Happens again. 1, 2, 3. Here's what gets interesting. So a half note is equal to 2 quarter notes. Therefore, a half note in 3/4 is the duration of 2 beats. So therefore, 1 holds all the way over to 3 with our tie here. So we can put 2 and 3 in parentheses. And then because we have an 8th note here at the very end, the last part of the measure, we're missing half a beat. This 8th note fills that gap. We use and. So this is like 1 and 1 and so on. Then we hold on to 1 again. 2 is within this note and 3 is silent as a rest. We can use 2 parentheses in this case. In this case, they mean 2 different things, but in any situation, we're not hearing a new note strike. Then we go down here, we've got another half note. 1, 2 is a part of that same note. 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1. And then we hold it out. And then beats 2 and 3 are in parentheses again. So a pretty straightforward rhythm as far as the melody goes. We do have the tie and the slur is a bit of a complication there, but this is pretty straightforward. This is really playing in the meter. So let's go ahead and listen to this example. Now that we know the counting for it, you can listen for the counting in the accompaniment and you can listen for the counting in the melody. So this is going to start right at the beginning here and do your best to try to follow along. So yeah, there you go. We counted an entire, basically, chunk of a melody for a piece, including its accompaniment. And I'll mention again, so everything that we look at example-wise that comes from an actual piece of music, I put in the Spotify playlist. This piece in particular, every time I've taught this class, people that haven't heard this before usually love this piece because it is quite lovely. So yeah, all of the music that we listen to today will be on Spotify. Okay, any questions before we move on? Okay, let's move on. So let's do some more counting practice, some more just nuts and bolts counting practice, and then we'll spend the rest of the class today listening to different meters in context. So these are all simple times: 2/4, cut time, which is 2/2 of course, And here's 2-1. Here's one that is a rare meter that we'll just take a look at as an exercise. What do all of these have in common? Can anybody tell me, either speak up or say in the chat? Besides they're all simple times, we know that. What do they all have in common besides that? Yes, exactly. Thank you, Larson. Yes, there are 2 beats in every measure in each of these examples. I will reveal these as we go. That's why they're whited out like that. So we'll see rhythms there too. So they're all duple meters. They're all in 2. Duple, simple, or simple duple. The order doesn't really matter there. So try counting the 2-4 example. This is a pretty short rhythm. I'll give you some time. Remember that when we have beams like this, notice that this has a cut off little beam and then the longer beam. So this is an 8th note in the middle, and this is a 16th note on either side. So 16th note, 8th note, 16th note. Okay. So take 30 or 40 seconds. Go ahead and try out the counting for just this measure of 2-4. Okay, so let's just reveal the answer and then talk through it a bit. So here we go. 2-4, the quarter note gets the beat. Therefore, 2 8th notes in the first beat is 1 and. The second beat gets complicated because we break off into 2 E and but that and is kind of in the middle there. We've displaced where our 16th notes are. We've kind of shoved in an 8th note in a kind of awkward place. So if we think of this 8th note as being 2 16th notes tied together, for instance, we'd have 1 E and where the and has been silenced by the rhythm. So does this make sense? This is kind of a tricky rhythm, but it actually happens pretty frequently. We saw this in the ragtime example yesterday, actually, this exact rhythm. Okay, so now try counting the cut time example. So once again, cut time is 2-2. 2 beats in a measure, the half note gets the beat. So take 30 or 40 more seconds and try the cut time example. Now, some of you may be wondering why 4-4, for instance, is so common as a time signature. The reason is because things like this. With 4-4, if the quarter note gets the beat, if anything's less than a quarter note, it's going to all be beamed together in a way that's easy to see. In this case, because the half note gets the beat, if you were to add a beam to these, you would change them from quarter notes to 8th notes. So we can't beam them. So it gets much harder to see where the beats are when you're dealing with bigger note values like that. That's part of the reason why whole note and half note based meters have slowly fallen out of favor, and why quarter note meters kind of are the most common thing now. So here's the counting for this. 1 and, because we have half note gets the beat, 2 quarter notes equals a half. An 8th note is a quarter of a half note. Therefore, 2 E and is there and okay? So let's go ahead and try the 2-1 example. What gets the beat in 2-1? The 1 in this case refers to whole notes. So there are 2 whole notes in this single measure. So take another 30 seconds and do the counting for this final measure. Okay, so here's the counting for this. And some of you may have caught on to what I'm trying to illustrate here too. So if the whole note gets the beat, whole notes divided into 2 half notes. Therefore, if we have 2 half notes, we have 1 and. The quarter note is a quarter of a whole note. Therefore, 2E tied over A. Well, look at that. All 4 of these have the same counting. Okay? They're all exactly the same rhythm, and they all sound just like this. I'll play that again. Basically, this is an illustration to show that we can notate the same thing many different ways. For any aspiring composers out there, there's many different reasons why we would notate something in a particular way. But also, as you can see, despite the complications that arise with 16th notes sometimes, that's why quarter note based time signatures are pretty common, because they're usually user friendly for both performer, for aspiring theorists, for composers, for everybody. And that's why 2-1 is really complicated, because if you were to hear that rhythm, bum, bum, bottom, bum, this doesn't really get the job done of looking like that. It doesn't really look like how it sounds. So there's something to be said for that. Any questions on this? Okay. With our remaining time, I want to do some listening. So we've spent a lot of time looking at notation. So let's tie these concepts back to listening. So let's go through 3 kind of case study time signatures and talk about like what music is usually associated with those time signatures, because you don't use the same time signature for everything. And sometimes genres have specific requirements for what the meter should be. For instance, marches are often in duple time. Most every march is in duple time. You can think of parade marches, military marches, anything that would be a march. Usually 2/4, but sometimes in cut time and 2/2 as well. Now you may be going, well, why is it in 2 and not in something else? Well, we have 2 legs. That's basically the reason for it. Music we're going to be marching to, it's easy if every measure is left, right, left, right, left, right. So that is exactly why marches are in duple time. It allows the music to help make the marching, the physical act of marching in a parade, easier to handle. So this is true for military marches as well as for circus music, actually. So listen for the pattern of strong, weak, and how the music is emphasized. So it's basically like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You may hear something like or something like that. You can think of it also as like down, up, down, up, down, up. We won't talk about conducting, but what a conductor of an orchestra does is provide in some ways the meter and the information for the meter. So if a conductor was conducting a piece in 2, they would go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and so on. So here's 2 American march composers. Marches, of course, exist in many, many different countries and musical cultures. But here's Sousa, famous for his American military marches, and then Carl King, who wrote essentially a march for the circus company, Barnum and Bailey. Both of these are actually still played pretty regularly by military bands, high school bands. America has a wind ensemble, a wind band tradition. So march music is actually a pretty common feature in a lot of our K-12 education. So here is John Philip Sousa's. This is the high school cadet. So try to listen for the down, up, 1, 2 patterns. So the ways that the percussion and the sousaphones play reinforces that. The sousaphone often goes bum, 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 bum. And the bass drums often hit on every beat, and snare drums and cymbals often go on in between beats, and so on. Now, this is much faster. It's a circus march, and it's much more comical, but it's the same basic principle, just sped up and a little bit wackier. So here's Carl King's Barnum and Bailey's Favorite. And so on. So circus music in the military, unsurprisingly aligned in some ways. So here we go. Moving on to waltzes. So if any of you, even if you've never studied music, never played music, never done anything with music before, most everyone knows what a waltz is. Waltzes are always in triple meter, usually 3/4. It's a dance form. So the music was written to accompany a style of dancing. So they have to be in the same meter. There's no such thing as a waltz that's not in 3, because the dance is a 3-step. It has to be in 3. So that's why you have dances that have similar styles like this, especially older dances. There's other historical dance forms as well, but the waltz is the one that's most known these days. It still has a lot of cultural cachet, is still very famous. In Vienna, every year at New Year's, they still do waltzes. It's a thing. Listen for the familiar pattern of bop, 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 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, kind of like a triangle, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So here's 2 examples. Both are particularly famous in very different ways. The one on the left is actually almost a joke these days in how it's used. It was famously used in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, but it's just one of the most famous waltzes in history from the Viennese composer Johann Strauss. The second one is from a Russian composer. It's Suite for Variety Orchestra. So you actually hear guitar and saxophone. And he wrote a suite of pieces, including 2 waltzes, and this is the second of those. So let's listen to Strauss. This is the Blue Danube, referring to a river. Yeah, a little bit liberal in the stretching of time there. You can see that they kind of take a little bit of pauses and my speed kind of changed, but it all stayed in 3 throughout. So here is the Shostakovich piece. He was a Soviet composer. Suite for Variety Orchestra Waltz number 2. So listen for the saxophone melody especially. This is actually, I just realized this, these are both from Stanley Kubrick movies. This is from 2001: A Space Odyssey. This one on the right is from Eyes Wide Shut, if anybody ever has time to watch a movie these days. Here we go. So yeah, the last two slides have been very march or Western art music or classical kind of heavy, because in classical music, there's a lot more metrical variety. In certain things, like certain types of jazz, prog rock, metal, you do see interesting meter choices, but basically, almost everything else is in quadruple time. Almost everything else. Most Western music is in 4/4 or some quadruple time. If you take the entire scope of all music in history, I would say 90% of it is probably in 4/4. So that's not an exaggeration. And as you can see with my examples at the bottom, it's going to get wacky here in a second, so prepare yourselves. There's a natural symmetry to 4/4. You've got this kind of pattern of 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a good amount of time. It allows for symmetry into 2s, 4s, and 8s in terms of how many measures you have. It allows melodies to flow, but also gives us a lot of time for variety, which is why you see 4/4 more than 2/4. 2/4 is actually kind of harder because there's less time in a measure to kind of play around with rhythm. And if you do so, you basically just make 4/4 again. So here's 3 extremely different examples all in 4/4 time. I tried to deliberately pick examples that would be completely different in their sound, in their vibe, in their audience, but they all are in the same time signature. So, sorry about that. I accidentally started early. That got really wacky there for a second. Okay, here we go. So try to hear, each measure basically has a really big beat 1. It's called the downbeat. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So try to hear the patterns of 4 in each of these 3 recordings. Different types of music emphasize different beats. For instance, if you ever hear like a strong 2 and 4, it's called a backbeat, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, which is common in both jazz and in rock in very different ways. And if you've ever heard, like, I like to call it like the boots and cats rhythms, like the boots, cats, that kind of rhythm, that's a 4 feel on a drum set. So try to hear the patterns of 4 in each of these different recordings. So first up is Mambo. This is Cuban Mambo from the composer Perez Prado. This is his tune Mambo Lupita. So let's start off with this. Quiet Bee Gees. Sorry, the Bee Gees started. Here we go. There we go. Technical difficulties here. Perez Prado.
Lupita, no sé. ¿Qué le pasa a Lupita? No sé. ¿Qué es lo que quiere? Bailar. ¿Por qué ella no baila? Su papá. ¿Qué dice su papá? Que no. ¿Qué dice su mamá? Que sí. Que baile Lupita. Sí, sí. Que baile Lupita. Sí, sí. ¿Que quiere bailar? Mambo. Sí. 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 ¡Ah! Mambo, 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 sí. Sí. Sí.
And so on, and it continues and continues. Okay, so now something totally different. Here's Bee Gees. Here's some disco, literally. Disco is famous for its 4 on the floor rhythms. So listen for the drums in particular. Yeah, so if you have any desire to listen back to the Bee Gees later, it's interesting because the guitar, all the chords change. The guitarist strums on the downbeat on one, and then changes chords every 4 beats. That helps reinforce the 4 feel. So yeah, there's lots and lots of information happening all at once in any track of music. So focusing on one thing can be kind of difficult sometimes, but for meter especially, bass and drums are what describe meter the most, obviously, but everything is existing on top of those beats. So you can really try to find a way to hear everything that's fitting into a 4 pattern. So finally, now let's listen to Janelle Monáe and Esperanza Spalding. There's a track called Dorothy Dandridge's Eyes. So this is very different than those other two. It's also still in 4.
Looking out the corner of her eye as she sits alone and drinks her wine. Every man just wants to pass her by in hopes that he can catch her eye. That glow that's in her eye gives you visions in your mind. She's from another space and time. It's when you know you're hypnotized. Her intoxicating will not be denied. Oh, and when you touch her glove, she then becomes your drug. You fall so deep in love with the girl. It's too late, you're hypnotized. She's got Dorothy Dandridge eyes, and you love her, you love her, you love her, you love that girl. It's too late, you're hypnotized.
And so on. So again, I deliberately tried to pick the most crazy different examples to illustrate that they're all the same types of meters. Each of them have 4 quarter notes in a measure. Their quarter note gets the beat. The way that they build music on top of that is wildly different. Mambo versus disco versus jazz, pop, I mean, whatever Janelle Monáe feels like that day. Oh yeah, and then I know yeah. Thanks, Cole. Yeah, or pardon me, Larson. Yeah, that's great. Most everything is going to be in 4/4. Now, some things hide it better than others. Sometimes music is more complicated, or they play with time. For instance, I've mentioned that I'm a jazz musician. We'll hear a lot more jazz throughout. Jazz plays around by accenting the beats between beats, like the ands of beats, and. So because of that, it can get kind of hard to hear where the beat actually is sometimes. And even in pop music, like sometimes they hide it. So for instance, like I was listening to some Nirvana to try to see if there was something I wanted to pull for this. And Nirvana does similar things. They often hide the beats with where they put their strumming patterns. So not everything's going to be so clear cut as these examples, but most everything you're going to hear out in the wild, classical or otherwise, is going to probably be in 4/4. So because I had to play these manually, this might get a little weird for a second. Sorry. There you go. Okay, so tomorrow, next time, we're going to talk about a different way to divide time, which is compound meter. So we spend a lot of time on simple time. To just let you know, simple time is dividing beats into 2s. Compound time divides beats into 3s. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. How to count it. We'll listen to more stuff. We'll listen to, just like today, we're going to basically do the exact same format as today, focus a lot on notation, and then spend some time listening in context. So after that on Thursday, we'll do a lot more of just like practices, practicing. There'll be a lot more kind of just like theoretical examples that we can kind of do as a class, and then also talk about ways to play with time in a way that makes it more interesting. So syncopation and tuplets. Tuplets is just a fancy way of saying that we borrow simple time and compound time, or vice versa, because you don't have to always stay in one place. You can be more fluid and flexible with your music. So great. At this point, I know that we're, I guess, a little early again today, but rather than beating a dead horse, I'll stick around if there's any questions. So let me know if you have any questions for me. Don't forget that your homework is due tomorrow night. So you at this point are equipped to handle everything on your homework. We will go over some simple time review a little bit tomorrow too, but you can go ahead and get started on that tonight. Isn't there also irregular time? Yes, that's a great question, Kevin. We're not going to talk about irregular time, sometimes called asymmetrical time. Basically, you can have measures where they're not symmetrical. Say you have 5 beats in a measure or 7 beats in a measure. We're not going to have time to talk about that as a class, but that would be something great to follow up on email or office hours for anybody interested in irregular or asymmetrical time. Yeah, that's a great question. Other questions? Okay, great. I will be uploading this to YouTube again. I will put these slides to YouTube and I'll fix my mistake on that second slide. Great, and if anything comes up between now and tomorrow, just reach out and ask me a question. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for all being here, and I'll see you then.